Hello, Internet, and welcome back after a very long period where I haven't actually done anything, but we're back. We're ready. Let's get back to doing this. More specifically, let's get back to talking about war because that's entertaining and uplifting. Anyway, we're going to do a fairly short one today because my voice still isn't where I really want it to be, so I can't talk for the 30 minutes or more that will be needed for the either the Battle of Vienna, which will probably take closer to an hour probably, or the Magna Carta video I promised. So today we're going to be talking about the attack on Marstrand, or the Battle of Marstrand, during the Great Northern War in 1719, at the very end of the Great Northern War, in fact, where the Dano-Norwegian naval officer Peter Vessel, better known as Vice Admiral Thundershield, and yes, that was actually his name. He was ennobled as Mr. Thundershield. Don't say that the Danish kings at the time didn't have a flair for the dramatic. Had to take a very strong fortress up in Bohuslän on the western coast of Sweden to basically allow a Danish army to try a land invasion of Sweden after the death of Charles XII. It has become famous because a lot of legends have sprung up about how he took it with basically a lot fewer men than he was supposed to have been able to do for the time and place, and that leads to some ideas that he basically had his men march around to pretend to be a lot more and trick the Swedes into surrendering basically without losing a man. This is not quite true, but he did use quite a lot of psychological warfare to take this fortress. But anyway, this is getting too long-winded and it can be part of the actual video, so yeah, enjoy. So, let's start with the Great Northern War. What was it? The Great Northern War was a conflict that was fought from 1700 sharp to about 720, though most fighting petered out around 1719. It was a war that was basically being fought to... Well, it was being fought by an alliance between Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Denmark, which was then Denmark-Norway, to curb the rising regional powers of Sweden, which had, since the end of the 30-Year Wars, basically created a massive empire controlling most of the Baltic Sea coast with the very lucrative trading going on over there, but also spreading into, well, Norway, which was then part of Denmark. They had taken over the old Danish core lands in what is now southern Sweden. They had taken over several territories in the northern German and Polish coast, hell, even over towards the border with Holland, or modern-day Holland. And they were absolutely encroaching on the area that Peter the Great of Russia had decided to take for its own. What was a rather major problem at the time was, of course, that all the major powers were really busy fighting the War of Spanish Succession, so there was no one around to help either of the two sides. So they basically had to fight things out amongst themselves, since no one else was really all that interested in forcing a peace treaty, because, entire Europe were kind of busy at the moment. The Swedes were led by their very charismatic and very skilled, if somewhat impetuous and overly aggressive, King Charles XII. Russia was led through most of the thing by Peter the Great, and Denmark was led by a bunch of really bad kings. I'm not saying they really were bad kings, but they were absolutely not generals. For the first long time, war went absolutely Sweden's way. They battled the Russians and beat and battered them black and blue, forced Denmark out of the war, and in fact took over part of the Danish area, part of more Danish areas up in Norway, and looked almost undefeatable, at which point came the catastrophic defeat at Poltava, where the Russians annihilated the Swedish army and in fact forced the Swedish king to seek refuge in Turkey, of all places. The war dragged on again after that. Denmark re-entered it and had some remarkable naval victories that meant that Denmark was safe from land invasion, at least, though the Swedes could still attack Norway, and the Swedes were busy trying to hold on to their possessions in what is today the Baltic nations of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia from Russian encroachings. However, the war was mostly petered out when in 1717 the Swedes tried one last ditch attempt to once more force Denmark out of the war with a land attack on Norway. However, during that land attack, this Peter Vessel, who had a year earlier been ennobled as, well, Thundershield, that was, again, I want to point out his name, had sunk most of the western Swedish war fleet, and now he also managed to destroy resupply convoys. That meant that the Swedes were caught during winter in front of a very strong Dano-Norwegian fortress without really any supplies. It was at this point that Charles XII was killed, supposedly by a bullet fired by the defenders of this fortress up at Fredriksten. Considering the fact that the wound seemed to have been in his back, he would either have turned his back on the fortress, or, as some has suggested, he was then assassinated by, well, one of his own officers, who had probably at this time gotten very tired of fighting a losing war. This meant that the Swedish army retreated. The weather was terrible. They were retreating over a very inhospitable mountain chain, and the army was literally destroyed. The Danes chose this moment then to re-attack Sweden by land by sending their Dano-Norwegian army down into, as I said, Bohuslän, to try to overrun that and possibly get their own Scanian possessions back. The war, that particular thing started out fairly well, but at Marstrand, a very, very, very powerful fortress of Karlsten remained. And also that was where the remainder of the Swedish Western war fleet squadrons were placed. So, what to do? We can't leave that around, but the army have better things to do than to try to lay siege to a fortress that was actually on a small island off the coast of Marstrand. So, well, we call for Mr. Thundershield, give him a fleet, and send him up there to take the fortress. And, well, that he proceeded to do. Thundershield had gathered a, for northern circumstances, fairly substantial strike fleet consisting of more than 18 vessels, including 7 ships of the lines with gunboats, frigates, sloops, and whatever else was necessary. He could also, if necessary, expect some kind of cooperation with the Dano-Norwegian land army that was in Bohuslän at the time, and might also request reinforcement by the Danish Vice Admiral Rosenpalm, who generally had overall command of the theater from a naval perspective. The Swedes had this incredibly powerful fortress, probably the most powerful Swedish land fortress actually ever designed up until that time, and also the remainder of the Gothenburg squadron under Admiral Jonas Örnfeldt, who had escaped Thundershield's earlier victory and had taken refuge near Marstrand because that was where the relief convoys for the Swedish army in Norway was to be gathered. Thundershield's first move thus had to be to eliminate the Swedish navy, and this was basically achieved by sailing as many ships as he could into the harbor past the fortress cannons and then engage in war. At this particular point, however, he had some luck, because the Swedes were ordered to use their ships to block the outer harbor, where they would be out of immediate range of the fortress's cannons. The fortress's cannons could still reach out there, but they would not be as effective as at point-blank range. So basically, Thundershield could manage to take on the Swedish fleet in close-up combat outside the most powerful defenses the Swedes could erect against him. This was done fairly easily. The Swedes was driven back into the town and eventually had to sink their own ships, because what Thundershield did was land some troops on the landward side out of reach of the fortress and basically conquer the town of Marstrand itself. At this point, there was a severe risk that the Swedish ships would fall into Danish hands, and the Swedes then scuttled their own fleet. At this point, the city was now in Danish hands without too many deaths, and only the fortress remained. Now, as I said, that was on top of a hill of an island outside the town proper, so it could have taken a long time to reduce, or would need a lot more men to actually conquer than Thundershield held available. He had about 500 troops available, and there were about 350 men in the fortress. The commander of the fortress had asked for about 400 or 500 extra men to hold it, but they, while on the way, hadn't actually arrived yet at this time. Thundershield knew they would be coming, of course, and he also felt like he had to take the fortress quickly in order to, well, prevent any sort of nasty surprises. The problem was, of course, that he only had like a 0.8 man advantage over the Swedes, and at the time it was common military knowledge that if you needed to actually storm a fortress, especially a very powerful fortress, you would need at least a 3 to 4 time manpower superiority if you were going to be successful. And since storming the fortress was probably the only way he could take it quickly, he was in something of a bind. What he did, however, to start with, was to land some troops on the island at a place where it was undefended. During a later court-martial, the Swedish commander was chastised for leaving the island thus undefended for Thundershield's landings, but he claimed that if he spread his men around too much and took cannons from already existing defensive positions, he would basically have been overrun in short order. But with Thundershield's soldiers on the island and his fleet sailing around bombarding the fortress and, of course, being shot at in return, the Swedes were now under siege. The thing is, a siege was not what Thundershield wanted, because a siege would again take a lot of time that he didn't feel he had. So he had to be sneaky. There are rumors that he marched his men around, or myths that he marched his men around while changing their uniforms, so the Swedes would think that he actually had a lot more troops available to him. It's actually become a saying in Danish, and I actually think even partially in Swedish, Thundershield soldiers, which is basically trying to get few people to look like a lot for one reason or another. It doesn't seem to have actually been true, because the Swedes, from the court-martial records that we still have after the battle, basically says that Thundershield had about 500 men according to their calculations, which was, well, what he himself said he had. So there seemed to have been some truth about that. However, he did try to negotiate with the fortress regarding a negotiated surrender, but at first, since it had to do with bribing the commander to surrendering and threatening to torch the city that he held and so on, nothing as much was really happening, especially since Charles XII, who had, of course, recently just died, but he still had a law on the book saying that any fortress commander who gave up his fortress without good reason and the most strenuous attempts to, well, not to keep it, would be summarily executed. So that was obviously not something that the colonel who commanded the fortress had any sort of real interest in being. So for another day or two, more Danish cannon positions were established, and the fortress was heavily shelved. However, it could have actually been even worse, because Thundershields should have had access to some artillery, some army artillery officers that was with him, with their equipment and siege guns. However, since he was a naval officer and they were under army command, and they simply didn't believe that he would be able to take the fortress with his resources at hand, they refused to cooperate. So he was forced to rely on men from his own navy. So Thundershield felt that he was in trouble, because while he was shelling the fortress, it didn't exactly seem like the guns he had available would probably be able to breach their walls, that his fairly few troops could run an actual storm on it without sort of really, losing more men than it has been relevant. So for a while, actually a few days, nothing really happened. And then again, Thundershield knew that he had to do something drastic. He reckoned that while his position was actually fairly bad, the personality of the colonel commanding the fortress meant that he probably thought that his position was even worse. So he once again sent a negotiator up to the fortress, threatening to torch the town and murder everyone inside the fortress if they didn't give up immediately, because as they could see, he was establishing new gun positions even closer to the fortress, and soon they would be very, very, very dead. This was a bluff, but again, bluffs can be very efficient, as subsequent events proved, because, well, the commander then held a war council with his officers, and they all agreed that, yes, we don't really have that many men, and we're probably running short on ammo, and we're probably running short on food, and we're probably not going to get help from the outside. So yeah, let's negotiate a ceasefire and then probably surrender. And that was probably what they did. Basically, Thundershield had, by moving people around and shooting cannons at a fortress that could do it no harm, bluffed the commander of that fortress into surrendering the fortress. And over the next few days, the Swedish troops marched out, was disarmed, sailed over to the landward side, and allowed to go their own way. Thundershield now had control of both the town and the fortress, and could start the process, if he wanted, of raising the Swedish fleet, and that was scuttled in town, in the harbour, and add them to his own. Major success. Good job. It was after that he was promoted to Vice Admiral. Unfortunately, as we will get into later, the rest of his life didn't go quite as well as it had up until now, but this was actually a rather remarkable victory. It was the first sort of real Danish land victory over the Swedes that had come as result of Danish aggression for quite some time at this moment, and it lent some credence to the belief that Denmark might actually be able to regain at least part of their old Swedish core lands with the threat that Sweden was under from actual Russian invasion and now Dano-Norwegian invasion. And there was supposed to be their king was dead, there was supposed to be some peace talks, so with any luck, Denmark might actually achieve their goals. This is when the narrative said they didn't achieve their goals, but, well, they tried, and it was a magnificent victory by Peter Wessel. So, what was the takeaway from this particular battle? Well, in the end, it wasn't actually all that much. The Danish army in Bohuslän did not take on the remainder of the Swedish army, and in fact withdrew into Norway. A year later, the peace had been created, and Denmark did not get exactly as much back as they thought they would. Russia gained practically everything because they had been the primary enemy of Sweden. Sweden lost a lot of their Baltic coastlands and had to give back the stuff they had taken earlier in the war in Norway from Denmark, but the status quo of Sweden actually controlling the entire southern Swedish peninsula rather than Denmark getting back their old Scandinavian core lands was long gone. So overall, the nations didn't really get that much out of this particular battle. However, it made, if it hadn't already been made, it created Thundershield's reputation. The problem was, the war was over. He didn't really have anything else to do, so he went a-traveling, and later that same year, he was accidentally killed in a duel in Germany with a former mercenary colonel who had fought in Swedish service. So yeah, at that point he was 30 years old. Who knows what might have happened to this man if he had not died during that period. But I might actually come back later with an actual sort of biography video of Thundershield, because he is one of the more fascinating characters in Dano-Norwegian history, being a fairly poor son of a merchant in Norway, who in only like 6 years or so, made his way up from common seaman to admiral, and then vice admiral and nobility in Denmark, which is a fairly decent rags to riches story, especially since it basically happened from his own skill rather than, court appointments and so on and so forth. But yeah, that was the Battle of Marstrand, where the Swedes were basically tricked into surrendering a fortress based on the fact that the Danish commander read them very, very well and had control of both land and navy, which is how things should be. Again, this is not a fairly complicated battle, but I've always just liked it, and I felt like you might be interesting to hear about it. And, to finish off, the commander of the Swedish fortress was court-martialed, and the court found that he had not acted in the way he should, and chopped his head off. So, yeah. Don't surrender your fortresses unless you have to, people. I guess that is, in the end, the takeaway from this particular battle. This will just be a short video, he said. 10 minutes, he said. Yeah. No. We have to get it up to 25 because I just can't shut the fuck up. I deliberately chose this battle because it was simple, it was easy, it was just boom, 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 boom. The Swedish lost their nerves and marched out. Thundershield won. Nope, 25 minutes of talking, and that will absolutely help my voice. Idiot. Oh well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. It was, like I said, a fairly simple battle. What is interesting in it, like I said, is basically that it can get me back to making videos and back to talking about things again. Secondly, you might actually, if you're at all interested in this sort of thing, start reading somewhat up on the whole situation, because, well, the Great Northern War is actually a fairly interesting affair, even if it's kind of overshadowed by the greater events of the War of Spanish Succession that happened at the same time. But it's always also interesting because there's a lot of really, really interesting people around. Charles XII, for instance, a lot of his generals, Peter the Great, some of his generals, some of the rulers of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and as I mentioned, this fellow right here, Peter Vessel, Mr. Thundershield, who I definitely actually will get back to doing a biography video of, because I feel like, well, he's someone that would be interesting to people. But anyway, I have blathered enough. My voice doesn't like me anymore, but I hopefully will return next week. The thing about doing a video each week might, at my current schedule, be completely undoable, or might be somewhat undoable, but I hope to get back to doing a video a week. If not, I should at least be getting back to doing a video every 2 weeks. So, yeah. Well, again, I'm blathering. You can see I'm not in the habit of shooting right now. So, well, until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.